I caught my future daughter-in-law pouring industrial-grade super glue over the exact spot where my disabled wife was supposed to sit. And the worst part was my own son was standing right beside her, keeping watch and laughing. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I handled it the way a man who spent 40 years in commercial construction handles a structural flaw. I took care of it without a word. 2 hours on, when the MC called the glowing bride to her feet for that opening dance, the sound of $18,000 in designer lace being ripped apart tore through the hushed ballroom, and she couldn't move an inch. But before any of that makes sense, you need to understand what I walked into in those 2 hours leading up to the ceremony. My name is Gerald Harwick, 70 years old, and every one of them poured into building a commercial contracting company from nothing. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you stayed. If these stories of quiet strength and hard-won justice mean something to you, a like and a subscription mean a great deal to me. Before we go any further, drop one word in the comments that captures exactly how you're feeling right now, sitting with this story. Just one word. I'd love to read them. A quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it clearly, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. I know the smell of drywall, the weight of steel, and the exact cost of loyalty. It was a Saturday morning, exactly 2 hours before the guests were scheduled to arrive at the most exclusive luxury wedding venue in the city. I was there early because I had just paid $18,000 out of my own pocket to upgrade the ballroom sound system. Brendan, my son, had casually mentioned that the standard setup would ruin their wedding photos. Like the fool I was, I wrote the check. I wanted everything to be perfect for him. The grand ballroom sat completely empty, wrapped in that dim, hushed stillness that settles over a space just before something enormous begins. The caterers were out at the loading dock, and the florists had already put the finishing touches on their elaborate centerpieces. I moved quietly across the thick carpet, just an old man taking in the expensive setup he had funded. But as I drew closer to the raised platform, where the sweetheart table and immediate family seating had been arranged, I heard something. A low, muffled giggle. I stopped cold, letting the darkness of the stage wing swallow me. Standing right at the edge of the family table were my son Brendan and his bride-to-be Sienna. Sienna wasn't in her wedding dress, yet she had on a silk robe with the word bride stitched across the chest. But her hands weren't holding makeup or a mirror. She was gripping a heavy industrial squeeze bottle. She was leaning over the plush, velvet-cushioned chair marked explicitly with a gold name tag. Elaine, my wife, Brendan's mother. Elaine had suffered a mild stroke 8 months ago. She pulled through, thank God, but her mobility had taken a serious hit. She got around with a cane, moved at a careful pace, and had to wear protective adult undergarments because she sometimes lost control of her bladder under stress or strain. It was a humiliating reality for a proud woman, and we guarded it as a strict family secret. Sienna knew this. Brendan knew this. I stood there watching my blood go cold as Sienna squeezed a thick, clear gel directly onto the center of Elaine's velvet cushion. She worked it in, methodically pressing it deep into the fabric fibers. Brendan stood right beside her, stealing glances toward the main doors. He nudged her with his elbow. "Make sure you get the edges," I heard him whisper. "If she shifts around, I want to make sure it holds." Sienna let out that same high-pitched, malicious giggle. "Don't worry," she said. "Once she's been sitting on this a few hours, she won't get up without leaving half her dignity right there on that chair." For just a fraction of a second, the father in me reached for any other explanation. I wanted to believe my only child was not standing there orchestrating the public humiliation of the woman who raised him. I stepped out of the shadows. My heavy footsteps rang out across the polished marble. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. My voice was flat, stripped of everything. Sienna lurched so hard she nearly fumbled the bottle, shoving it quickly behind her back, eyes wide. Brendan spun around. The blood left his face for just a moment. Then, with a chilling ease I had never witnessed in him before, he pulled himself together. He actually smiled. He stepped in front of Sienna, blocking my line of sight to her hands. "Dad," he said, releasing a slow, casual sigh. "You startled us. We were just taking care of a small issue over here." I climbed the steps to the platform and stopped 2 feet from where they stood. I didn't look at Sienna. My eyes went straight to my son's. "Fixing what problem, Brendan?" I asked. "The cushion on Mom's chair." Brendan said, his voice thick with manufactured concern. The velvet threading on the seat was coming loose. Sienna had spotted it, and she was just applying a little clear fabric tape to hold it down. He knew how moms struggle getting up and down these days. They were just worried she might slide or lose her footing if the fabric gave. They were looking out for her. They wanted her to be safe today. It was a flawless lie. It sounded tender. It sounded like devotion. If I'd been some desk-bound man who'd never worked with his hands, I might have squeezed Brendan's shoulder and gone on my way with a full heart. But that was never who I was. 40 years on active construction sites had built me into something else entirely. And as I stood there drawing air into my lungs, a very specific, sharp, toxic chemical bite hit the back of my throat. That was not fabric tape. It was not any kind of craft adhesive. It was industrial-grade heat-curing polyurethane compound. On job sites, we used it to bond heavy materials intended to hold permanently. When the warmth of a human body activates it, that chemical sets and locks like hardened concrete, fusing itself permanently to any porous surface it contacts. Everything snapped into focus with a sickening weight. If Elaine lowered herself into that chair and the $6,000 embroidered chiffon gown I had bought her for this occasion made contact with that treated velvet, the dress would literally bond to the cushion. The plan was for her to sit through 2 hours of dinner while the adhesive cured. When the music started and she went to rise, the chair would go with her. The gown would be torn clean away. She would pitch forward her protective undergarments exposed in front of 300 guests, high society figures, investors' family. This was not a prank. It was a calculated psychological assassination. And my son was the lookout. I studied the dark, wet stains soaking into the velvet. Then I looked back at Brendan. He was holding his breath, reading my face for any sign I'd swallowed the story. Every instinct I had screamed at me to grab him by the collar and drag him out of that room, but something colder and deeper rose up and locked that instinct down. If I erupted right now, they would walk it back. An accident, a misunderstanding, and I'd be the unhinged old man who torched his son's wedding. I needed to know what was driving this. I needed them to believe they were the sharpest people in the room. I consciously relaxed my face. I let out a long, worn-out sigh, performing the role of the tired, oblivious father they had clearly cast me in. "I appreciate that, son," I said, keeping my voice soft. "Your mother has been wound so tight about today. Knowing you two are watching out for her, that means everything to me." Brendan's whole body loosened. His shoulders came down, and that arrogant little smirk crept back to the edge of his mouth. "Of course, Dad. We love her. We just want today to be perfect." "It will be," I said, turning my back on both of them. "I'm going to check in with the sound crew. Go get yourselves ready." I walked away and felt their eyes tracking me the whole length of the room. I could practically hear them exhaling in relief behind me. They were convinced the trap was still in place, still waiting for my wife. They thought they'd won. They thought this was over. But the moment I stepped back into the dim hallway, the father who had loved his son without condition quietly stepped aside, and the contractor who had spent a lifetime building things that last took his place. I wasn't going to remove that chair. I was going to give them the exact wedding they had engineered for themselves. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung shut at my back, swallowing the sounds of the venue coming to life. But the corridor gave me no quiet. My heart was hammering against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm I could feel all the way up in my jaw. I walked the length of that carpeted hallway with my spine straight and my pace unhurried and controlled. Anyone watching would have seen a proud father stealing a moment of calm before his son's wedding. Nobody could have seen that my entire understanding of my family had just cracked apart. The scent of that thick, clear gel was still seared into the inside of my nose. It's a strange thing about memory. You can lose a name, a date, a whole conversation, but a smell embeds itself somewhere you can't reach. I didn't need to read the label on that bottle to know what Sienna had been using. The sharp, acrid, unmistakably chemical odor that had hung in the air around that table was one I'd been breathing on commercial sites for decades. Industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive. It doesn't sit on a shelf next to craft supplies. It is a heavy-duty compound used by contractors to fuse concrete bind steel framing and permanently lock porous materials together. And my son had looked me square in the eye and called it fabric tape. I came to a stop near a tall, decorative window at the far end of the hall, staring out at the manicured grounds of the venue, though none of it registered. I was running Brendan's face on a loop. The absolute ease with which the lie had come to him was the most terrifying thing I had seen in my life. Not a stammer, not a flicker of hesitation. He had placed himself between me and his bride and smoothly constructed a story built entirely out of love and worry. We were just worried she might trip or slide off the chair. We want her to be safe today. He had taken his own mother's physical disability, her recent stroke, her fragility, and used it as cover for a vicious premeditated attack. Elaine had spent the past 8 months grinding through painful physical therapy just so she could walk down that aisle on my arm. She had wept in our bedroom out of sheer terror about looking diminished in front of his new in-laws. Brendan knew every bit of that. He knew her fears. He knew about the protective garments she wore. He knew each and every vulnerability she carried. And rather than standing guard over those vulnerabilities, he had turned them into weapons for a cruelty so calculated it went beyond anything I could have imagined. He had handed me a believable lie dressed up in the language of a devoted son counting on a father's blind love to swallow it whole. But Brendan had made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot who had raised him. He forgot where the money that paid for his elite education, his luxury cars, and this $300,000 wedding actually came from. It did not come from a corporate boardroom. It came from dust, sweat, and raw materials. For 40 years, I ran my commercial contracting company from the dirt up. I know exactly how polyurethane adhesive behaves. When that gel soaks into a porous surface like the velvet cushioning of a banquet chair, it doesn't simply rest on top. It works down into the fibers. It saturates the threading and then lies dormant, waiting to be activated by pressure and body heat. The instant someone sits down, the natural warmth accelerates the curing reaction. Within 30 minutes, it gets intensely tacky. Within an hour, it sets hard. By the time a 2-hour dinner service had run its course, that adhesive would have bonded the velvet cushion and whatever clothing was pressing into it into a single locked immovable mass. A chemical trap engineered with precision, installed without a trace, and sitting there in silence until its victim took her seat. My hands curled into tight fists inside my jacket pockets. I could feel my fingernails biting into my palms. The sheer depth of cruelty required to conceive of this was staggering. That bottle hadn't come from anywhere in the venue they had carried it in. This had been planned long before today. I stood at that window and forced myself to picture exactly what would have happened had I not come early to check on the sound system. I saw Elaine looking beautiful and fragile in the $6,000 embroidered chiffon gown I had bought her for this occasion, easing herself down onto that chair. She would have smiled through the ache in her joints. She would have sat through dinner with no idea what was quietly hardening beneath her. She would have applauded the speeches, and then the MC would have called for the family dances. Elaine would have reached for her cane. She would have pressed down on the armrests, using every ounce of her limited upper body strength to rise, and her body would not have moved. The chiffon would have been cemented to the velvet. Feeling 300 pairs of eyes land on her, she would have pushed harder. The delicate fabric would have given no resistance against cured polyurethane. It would have torn violently away from her body, leaving the back of her dress destroyed and fused to the seat. She would have gone down, exposed, humiliated, stripped of every shred of dignity in front of the city's elite. And Brendan and Sienna would have been sitting right beside her phones, most likely raised capturing her degradation, while pretending to rush to her aid. The image of my wife crumpled on a ballroom floor, while her own son filmed it, settled something in me, something cold and very, very still. The shock had completely burned off. Whatever grief I felt at learning what my son truly was had dissolved, leaving behind a hard mechanical clarity. I am a builder. When I find a rotten beam in a structure, I do not stand there mourning it. I take it out and I put something sound in its place. My son had just shown me where the rot lived. It went all the way to his core. I checked my watch. There was still time. The bridal party was due in the outdoor gardens for pre-ceremony photographs in about 10 minutes. The ballroom would be empty again. I slipped away from the window and eased open the door of a small utility closet near the service elevators. I stepped inside and drew the door to leaving just enough of a gap to hold the hallway in view. I stood there in the dark, breathing evenly, waiting for the two of them to leave the scene they had set. 10 minutes later, Sienna's loud, unguarded laughter rang down the corridor. Through the gap, I watched her and Brendan pass hand in hand, heading out toward the gardens to smile for the cameras. They looked so at ease, so pleased with themselves. I held still until their voices dissolved entirely into the distance. Then, I pushed the utility door open, smoothed the lapels of my jacket, and walked back toward the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. Time to run a structural inspection of my own. I needed to know precisely how far along the curing process had gotten. The torn piece of linen dangled from my fingers, its fibers already shredded, and the sight of it sent the full magnitude of their plan crashing over me. Brendan and Sienna had choreographed this with meticulous care. They had chosen this specific velvet chair, knowing exactly what would happen when Elaine sat down. Elaine had spent the last 6 months clawing her way back from the stroke. She had endured hours of grinding physical therapy just to walk into this ballroom tonight. She was terrified of being seen at her most vulnerable, but she trusted our family completely. I had found her the most beautiful gown I could, wanting her to feel like the queen she was on this day and every day after. My own son and his soon-to-be wife wanted to turn her into a public spectacle. They wanted the fabric to bond to the seat. They wanted her dress ripped away when she stood for the first toast. They wanted 300 high society guests to see the protective undergarments she depended on. The disgust that had been churning in my gut hardened into something colder and more precise. I was not going to remove that chair. I was not going to shut the evening down. I was going to deliver exactly what they had ordered, with one alteration they would never see coming. I took out my phone and called Wendell, my trusted estate manager. He picked up on the first ring, hearing the quiet tension wound through my voice. Within 5 minutes, Wendell came through the service doors. I showed him the torn napkin and indicated the velvet chair reserved for Elaine. His jaw tightened the moment he understood what had been done. I gave him a precise set of instructions for what needed to happen before the first guest arrived. We moved quickly and in silence, lifting the treated chair from the head table with careful hands. We exchanged it for the matching chair assigned to Sienna, making sure the arrangement looked exactly as it had. Then I directed Wendell to bring an identical chair up from the storage room and treat its seat with the same industrial adhesive, the spot where Brendan would be sitting before the night was out. The trap had been turned around and aimed at the people who had built it. With the seating quietly rearranged, I went back to the main hallway to meet my wife. Elaine looked absolutely radiant in her flowing gown, though her hands trembled faintly against the handle of her cane. I kissed her cheek and whispered whatever she needed to hear to calm the nerves she was fighting to hide. Brendan and Sienna came in from their private photo session wearing wide, practiced smiles. They swept over to compliment Elaine, their voices thick with a sweetness that turned my stomach. I watched them closely, clocking the sidelong looks they traded when they were sure I wasn't watching. They believed their plan was still running perfectly, with no idea that the catastrophe they had engineered was now aimed directly back at them. When the ballroom doors finally opened that evening, the city's elite poured in to fill the room with clinking glasses and polished small talk. I guided Elaine to the head table and drew out her chair with care. She sat down gracefully, her gown settling cleanly against the untreated velvet. Brendan and Sienna took their places moments later, smiling broadly as they settled into their seats. From the corner of my eye, I watched them shift their weight, pressing themselves firmly down against what was waiting for them beneath the fabric. Dinner was served without a hitch, the food and the spectacle of it all drawing the guests' attention away from the quiet building tension at the front of the room where we sat together over our meal. As the last plates were cleared, the moment for the traditional evening toasts moved swiftly into range. Brendan leaned toward me, his eyes lit with a sickening anticipation. He whispered that he and Sienna were going to be the first ones up. They wanted to honor Elaine publicly. I gave a slow nod, keeping my expression perfectly neutral as I offered my blessing. The master of ceremonies tapped a spoon against his crystal glass, and the room dropped into immediate silence. Brendan and Sienna reached for their microphones, turning their brilliant smiles toward the crowd. They planted their feet and pushed up from their velvet chairs, preparing to address the assembled audience of our peers, waiting in that grand, beautiful space. They did not rise gracefully. What followed instead was a sound of tearing fabric that cut through the hushed ballroom like a blade. Brendan cried out as his custom-tailored trousers split apart, exposing bare skin and brightly colored underwear to a room full of stunned onlookers. Sienna shrieked in pure horror as the fabric of her designer dress shredded violently, leaving her humiliated and exposed before her wealthy guests. They lurched and clutched at the remaining scraps of their ruined clothing, while the chairs clung stubbornly to their bodies for several agonizing seconds. A wave of disbelief rolled through the crowd, followed by scattered murmurs and poorly smothered laughter. I sat calmly beside my wife and watched justice arrive exactly as I had quietly and carefully arranged it. Brendan went a deep crimson, his eyes sweeping the room in wild disbelief, as the full collapse of his scheme registered on his face. Sienna dissolved into dramatic tears, retreating behind the floral centerpiece and turning her glare on the nearest catering staff. Elaine looked over at me with wide, bewildered eyes, completely unaware that this precise humiliation had been designed and intended for her. I closed my hand gently over hers and offered a calm smile before rising from my own perfectly untreated velvet chair. The room settled as I took the microphone from Brendan's shaking hands. The moment had come to drag the truth out into the light where everyone could see it. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying steadily across the ballroom, "we are gathered here tonight to celebrate a remarkable recovery." I let the silence stretch and grow heavy while Brendan and Sienna stood there in their shredded clothing. "However," I went on, "that certain individuals chose to use this occasion as a cover for a deeply disturbing scheme, one designed to humiliate my wife." A current of outrage moved through the room as faces shifted from confusion to comprehension. They treated a chair with industrial adhesive, intending to exploit her medical condition for their own amusement. Brendan shook his head in frantic denial, mouthing protests that nobody in the room was prepared to believe. Fortunately, I found their trap earlier today and made a simple adjustment to the seating arrangements. The collective gasp that went through the guests landed with a satisfying weight. I turned back to my son, and what had been a neutral expression became something harder and colder. "You set out to destroy her dignity. Instead, you put your own moral bankruptcy on display for every person in this room." I reached into my suit pocket and produced a folded set of legal documents. "This goes well beyond a cruel piece of theater," I said. "I have spent the past several hours going through the company's financial records." The color left Brendan's face entirely, his humiliation, swallowed whole by something that looked very much like terror. "I know about the offshore accounts and the forged signatures," I said clearly. "You are cut off, disinherited, and the authorities are standing by for you in the lobby right now." I walked back into the grand ballroom and eased the heavy oak doors shut behind me. The space was breathtaking, thousands of white roses, crystal centerpieces, a scene of perfect elegance built on the back of my labor. But as I moved toward the raised platform where the head table stood, all I could register was the ugliness concealed beneath the surface. I stopped in front of the two velvet chairs. Physically, they were indistinguishable. Same carved mahogany legs, same curved backrests, same plush cushions. The only thing separating them were the small gold-plated name tags resting on the table in front of each seat, one reading Elaine, the other Sienna. I reached into my trouser pocket and drew out the heavy-duty multi-tool I carried every day. A man who has spent his life on job sites does not go anywhere without something useful on his person. I crouched beside my wife's designated chair and felt for the 4 steel bolts holding the velvet cushion in place. Standard hexagonal screws, nothing a seasoned contractor couldn't move with leverage and patience. I worked the flat edge of the tool into the first bolt and applied slow, steady pressure, turning until the metal released with a soft click. Inside 2 minutes, I had completely unfastened the velvet cushion, soaked through with the invisible, curing polyurethane adhesive. I lifted it clear of the wooden frame, keeping my hands away from any treated surface. I set it carefully on the carpet. Then I moved to the identical chair assigned to my future daughter-in-law. I knelt down and ran through the same process. 4 bolts, same steady pressure, same result. I lifted Sienna's clean cushion free and carried it across to Elaine's chair frame. I lined up the screw holes and fed the bolts back in, tightening each one down with the tool's edge until the seat held firm and solid. My wife would settle into a perfectly safe chair. She would eat her meal undisturbed, shielded from the trap her own son had helped lay beneath her. I carried the adhesive-soaked cushion back to the bride's chair frame and fastened it down securely in its place. Sienna's seat was now the snare, the identical chemical trap she had prepared with such eagerness for a woman still recovering her strength. I stood up, closed the multi-tool, and slid it back into my pocket. The chairs looked entirely undisturbed. Nothing about them would arouse any suspicion. But as I stood there studying the swapped cushions, a cold, restless thought began working at the back of my mind. The immediate threat to my wife had been neutralized, but the root of the problem was still very much alive. People who plan acts of calculated cruelty like this don't do it for a cheap laugh. There is always something larger and darker underneath. Brendan was arrogant, yes, but he was also fiercely protective of his public image. He would never have risked triggering a massive, humiliating scene at his own high-profile wedding unless there was a significant payoff on the other side of it. So, what was the actual goal? Why go to the effort of exposing Elaine's medical vulnerabilities in front of 300 of the most influential people in the city? What could they possibly gain from putting her weakness on display before our investors, our colleagues, our entire social circle? The answer landed on me like something physical. They needed an audience. They needed witnesses. They wanted everyone in our professional and social world to watch my wife fail to see her lose control, to register her as diminished and broken. This was not a prank. It was a carefully constructed piece of theater. And theater requires documentation to shape the narrative afterward. If the plan ran that deep, I needed evidence. I needed their intentions captured on record. I turned and walked briskly out of the ballroom, threading through the back corridors until I reached the service exit. I put my shoulder into the heavy metal door and stepped out into the warm afternoon light. I crossed the asphalt parking lot at a quick pace toward my heavy-duty pickup. I unlocked the door, got in, and opened the secured center console. There, sitting alongside my measuring tapes and rolled blueprints, was a rugged voice-activated field recorder, a solid, durable piece of equipment I relied on to capture verbal contracts, supply orders, and site disputes over the roar of heavy machinery. Its microphone was built to pull voices cleanly from a loudy environment, and its battery would run for 48 straight hours without a charge. I took the recorder and a fresh roll of heavy-duty gray duct tape from the glove compartment, locked the truck, and made my way back to the venue through the service entrance, slipping past the catering crew as they unloaded crates of champagne. I made my way back into the grand ballroom and went straight to the sweetheart table. The table was skirted in thick cascading white linen that pooled all the way to the floor, perfect cover. I got down and crawled underneath, finding myself in a low, dark pocket of space directly beneath where Brendan and Sienna would be seated for the entire evening. I switched the field recorder on and confirmed the small red recording light was pulsing steadily. I tore off 3 long strips of gray duct tape. I pressed the recorder hard against the wooden underside of the table and secured it in place so it wouldn't shift or rattle during the dinner service. The microphone sat just inches from where their laps would be. It would pick up every whispered word, every malicious laugh, every secret exchange between them, while they waited for the adhesive to do its work. I crawled back out, dusting the invisible grit from the knees of my trousers. I stood alone in the center of that magnificent room and looked at what I had put in place. The physical danger had been redirected. The audio surveillance was running. And yet, something in me, a paternal instinct sharpened across 70 years of navigating both ruthless business and fatherhood, kept insisting I was still missing a central piece. A recording would capture their words during the reception, but it wouldn't reveal the foundation of their plan. I needed to understand exactly how they intended to use Elaine's public humiliation. I needed to see where this road was actually leading. People who conspire together always leave a digital trail. They text, they email, they write things down. I glanced up toward the grand staircase that led to the private bridal suites on the second floor. Brendan and Sienna were still outside, working through their lengthy professional photo session in the venue's manicured gardens, having left their personal belongings completely unguarded in their dressing rooms. My son was confident, entitled, and dangerously careless. It was time to use that carelessness against him. I left the ballroom and moved toward the sweeping marble staircase at the far end of the venue foyer. The catering staff was streaming in and out of the kitchen doors, too occupied to register the older man in the tailored suit climbing to the second floor. The upper level was given over entirely to the private bridal suites. I moved down the carpeted corridor past closed doors until I reached one marked with a small brass plaque, Groom. I pushed it open and stepped in. The room was entirely in character with my son, heavy with expensive cologne and the smell of spilled dark liquor. Crystal tumblers sat scattered across the mahogany coffee table, surrounded by discarded garment bags. A scene of arrogant celebration. I shut the door behind me and turned the lock. My eyes moved across the room, past the leather sofas, and settled on a sleek glass desk near the window. Sitting right in the middle of that desk, completely unattended, was Brendan's black laptop. I crossed to the desk and looked at the screen. My heart was going at a steady, measured beat. I reached out and touched the trackpad. The screen came to life, showing a smiling photo of Brendan and Sienna. Below their faces was a numerical keypad asking for a 4-digit security code. Brendan never updated his passwords unless someone forced him to. I entered his birth year. The screen rejected it. I tried Sienna's birth year, Rejected again. I held still for a moment and let out a slow breath. I entered the year my wife was born. The screen opened immediately. A bitter wave of irony moved through me as the home screen loaded. He had used his own mother's birth year to lock the device he was using to plot against her. He took everything from us, even the private milestones of our lives, and drafted them into service for his own ends. I didn't have the luxury of sitting with that pain. There was work to do. I passed over his banking folders and tapped the messaging icon, pulling up his private conversations. Sienna's name sat pinned at the top of the list. I opened their thread, a vast unbroken chain of daily messages. I didn't scroll through the wedding logistics. I went straight to the search bar and typed in Elaine. The screen buffered, then surfaced dozens of flagged messages. I scrolled back to a conversation dated 3 weeks earlier, right around when the seating chart was being finalized. I started reading, and whatever paternal warmth I still carried for my son emptied out of me. They did not speak about my wife as a person. They spoke about her as an inconvenience, a liability. Sienna complained at length about how Elaine's walking cane would ruin the look of the wedding photographs. Brendan agreed, grumbling about the cost of accessible transportation. As the dates moved closer to the present, the tone graduated from petty grievance to something far colder and more deliberate. I found a cluster of messages sent 2 days ago. Sienna had dropped a link to an industrial supplied website, the heavy-duty polyurethane adhesive. Beneath the link, she had written one line: "I bought it. It arrives tomorrow." My thumb paused over the screen as I read Brendan's reply. He didn't tell her to stop. He wrote back, "Perfect. Make sure you pack it so the old man doesn't see it." I steadied myself against the edge of the desk. I scrolled to the exchange from late the previous night. The words on the glowing screen pulled the temperature out of me. Sienna had opened the conversation. "I'm so nervous about tomorrow," she wrote. "What if she notices the cushion is wet before she sits down?" Brendan's reply came immediately. "She won't notice anything. Her legs are so numb from the nerve damage she can barely feel where she sits." I stared at that sentence and felt something give way in my chest. My son was weaponizing his own mother's medical suffering. The next exchange revealed a depth of premeditation I was not prepared for. Sienna wrote back, "Okay, but you have to promise me you'll have your phone ready to record. Once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you get the whole meltdown on video. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and your dad's investors is exactly what we need to prove our point." I read the words a second time. What point I opened Brendan's lengthy reply. "I know," he wrote. "Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam dunk case for a conservatorship." The air left my lungs. The suite felt as though the walls had moved inward. A conservatorship. This was a legal coup. I forced my eyes back to the screen. "We force him to hand over the trust to me now," Brendan had typed. "I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. Once Mom is declared a ward of the state, we can move her into a facility and take over the estate. This is our only way to get the money without waiting for nature to take its course." I set the laptop down on the glass desk and pulled my hands away from it as if the surface itself had burned me. The full scale of what they had constructed was almost beyond comprehension. They were engineering a public medical crisis from scratch, fabricating it deliberately for the sole purpose of stripping us of our legal standing. They wanted to humiliate Elaine so thoroughly that I would be left too broken and consumed to mount any defense, clearing the path for them to move on the estate. The one I had spent 4 grinding decades building from the ground up. I stood alone in that quiet room, listening to the muffled sounds of wedding preparations filtering up from below. He had looked at his mother's illness not as a family tragedy, but as a legal mechanism to exploit. Every smile, every embrace, every performance of gratitude had been a calculated act designed to keep me at ease, while he quietly positioned the knife. I looked at the screen one final time and burned every word of it into my memory. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. Men who have spent careers in commercial contracting don't squander energy on emotion when a structure is compromised. You assess the damage, you reinforce what still holds, and you bring down what needs to come down without hesitation and without mercy. Brendan believed he was running a sophisticated game against a tired, oblivious old man. He thought he had accounted for every variable standing between him and the inheritance. What he failed to account for was simple. I owned the board, I owned every piece on it, and I was the one who had written the rules. I lifted the tablet again, my hands perfectly steady, and moved quickly away from the messages into his main email application. I needed to understand exactly how far this financial rot had spread before I burned his treacherous world to ash. The sharp white glow of the email app lit up the dim bridal suite, throwing long shadows across the walls. My finger hovered over the digital keyboard. The text messages I just read were still scorching behind my eyes, branding themselves permanently into memory. I needed to see the logistical skeleton of their betrayal. A legal coup of this scale doesn't materialize overnight. It demands planning documentation and the willing cooperation of an attorney comfortable operating in the law's gray margins. I tapped the search bar at the top of the screen and typed the word conservatorship. The system paused for a fraction of a second before a long list of email threads filled the screen. The sheer volume of results twisted my gut. This was no passing impulse or fleeting temptation. This was a deliberate long-running operation. I opened the most recent email dated just 3 days ago. It was addressed to a private attorney, a man I didn't recognize working out of a boutique law firm downtown. The subject line read, "Final medical strategy and venue preparation." I drew a slow, measured breath and began reading the cold, clinical language my son had chosen to describe the woman who had raised him, sheltered him, and loved him without condition for every year of his life. Brendan had constructed a completely fabricated narrative regarding the recovery of Elaine from her stroke. He filled paragraph after paragraph, portraying her as hopelessly disoriented, physically failing, and wholly incapable of managing her own most basic needs. He deliberately reframed her moments of exhaustion as episodes of severe cognitive decline. He cast me as a stubborn, grief-clouded husband in deep denial about his wife's mental state, a man growing increasingly erratic and emotionally unraveled. The email carried an attached file holding the most intimate medical records of Elaine. Brendan had somehow managed to siphon her charts, her physical therapy evaluations, and her prescription lists without our knowledge. He was assembling a comprehensive dossier designed to strip us of our most fundamental rights. I scrolled down to the attorney's response. The lawyer advised Brendan that while the medical records were useful, judges in our state frequently hesitated to grant full conservatorship without a documented public incident demonstrating that the parents posed a danger to themselves or a disruption to those around them. The lawyer specifically requested concrete, undeniable, visual evidence of the supposed incompetence of Elaine and my inability to handle her condition. My son had replied with a chilling assurance. He instructed the attorney to finalize the petition and have it ready to file Monday morning. He guaranteed that the necessary public incident would take place that weekend. He wrote that the entire city would witness our collapse. I scrolled further down the chain, my vision blurring slightly from the raw malice radiating off the screen. Brendan had forwarded the attorney a series of attached image files. I tapped the first one, and the screen expanded to reveal a screenshot of a text message exchange between him and Sienna. It was the precise conversation they had had late the previous night, captured and archived as strategic evidence for their lawyer. Seeing those words framed in this legal context made them exponentially more devastating. Sienna had written, "Once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you record the meltdown. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and the investors of your father is exactly what we need." I stared at those words, absorbing the predatory, calculating viciousness behind them. She didn't simply want to humiliate her mother-in-law. She wanted to engineer a spectacle so degrading it would break Elaine's spirit beyond repair. Then I read Brendan's reply, preserved with perfect clarity in the screenshot. "I know. Combine that video with her stroke medical records and my lawyer says we have a slam dunk case for a conservatorship. We declare mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation, he will not fight it. We force him to hand over the Harwick Trust to me. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die." I read that final sentence again and again until the words dissolved into meaningless shapes glowing against a dark background. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. That was the absolute core of it. This was never about concern for Elaine's health. It was never about navigating a family crisis. It was entirely solely about the Harwick Trust. I had established that trust 15 years ago, channeling every dollar of hard-earned wealth into a secure financial structure built to shield my family across generations. It was designed to cover Elaine's medical care, secure Brendan's future, and fund the charitable causes we both believed in. Brendan was the sole heir, but the trust was structured so he wouldn't gain full, unrestricted access to the principal capital until he turned 50 or until both Elaine and I were gone. He had no interest in waiting for his inheritance. He wanted the keys to the kingdom now, and he was entirely willing to destroy his own parents to seize them. The depth of this betrayal was an abyss without a floor. He wasn't simply stealing money. He was attempting to legally erase our autonomy. A conservatorship would mean we couldn't make our own medical decisions. We couldn't control our own bank accounts. We couldn't even choose where we lived. Brendan would hold absolute authority to sell our home, discharge Elaine's trusted doctors, and place us in whichever facility he saw fit. He would rule over our lives with the precise cruelty he and Sienna were putting on display at this very moment. I set the tablet back down on the desk, making certain it landed exactly where I'd found it. The cold focus that had guided me through this ballroom returned, sweeping away every remnant of paternal heartbreak. I was standing at the edge of a battlefield, and the enemy shared my last name. They had constructed a weapon to execute a flawless legal coup using the tragedy of my wife as their primary ammunition. But every complex scheme needs funding, especially when it involves retaining downtown law firms and staging a $300,000 wedding. Their ambition required substantial hidden cash. They couldn't bankroll this operation from their own personal income. I needed to understand exactly where Brendan's money was coming from. Sienna had spent the past 6 months loudly proclaiming at every opportunity that her wealthy family was generously footing the astronomical costs of this lavish reception. I reached out and tapped the screen once more, closing the devastating email thread with the estate lawyer. I navigated back to the main inbox, eyes narrowing with sharp concentration. I took a deep, steadying breath to brace myself. The truth was sitting right there on the screen, waiting for me. I tapped the search bar again, but this time I wasn't searching for anything about a conservatorship. I typed in the names of the wedding vendors, the florists, the caterers, the venue management. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to expose his financial crimes without a shred of mercy. The results appeared instantly, flooding the screen with dozens of high-priority email threads. I started with the floral design company responsible for the thousands of delicate white roses currently adorning the ballroom below. Sienna had spent the last 6 months loudly boasting at every social gathering we attended about how her supposedly affluent parents were covering the entire tab for this $300,000 extravaganza. I tapped the first email and opened a detailed digital invoice totaling $50,000. I bypassed the itemized breakdown and scrolled directly to the billing information. My eyes landed on the payment routing details, and the nauseating reality of it struck me like a physical blow. The invoice was not billed to Sienna's parents. It was not billed to any personal account connected to her family. The payment was billed directly to Harwick Commercial, contracting my company. I closed the floral invoice and immediately pulled up the billing thread for the luxury catering service. The total for the gourmet dinner and open bar came to $84,000. I scrolled to the bottom of the page. Again, the invoice was billed directly to my commercial construction company. I opened the receipts for the venue rental, the live jazz band, and the custom wedding cake. Every single massive expense tied to this lavish celebration was being methodically drained straight from my corporate operating accounts. I dropped into the leather chair behind the glass desk, a cold and unfamiliar numbness spreading through my chest. Brendan was the vice president of regional operations for my company. I had handed him that title because I genuinely believed he was ready to shoulder the responsibility of overseeing our large-scale commercial developments. I gave him high-level clearance to authorize material purchases and manage budgets across our active construction sites. He had taken that deep professional trust and used it to engineer a massive coordinated theft. I needed to understand exactly how he was concealing these exorbitant luxury expenses from my accounting department. I navigated out of his personal inbox and logged directly into his corporate email, pulling up his approved project budgets for the current fiscal quarter. The sheer audacity of what I found was breathtaking. Brendan had officially registered a completely fictitious commercial project inside our corporate system. He had created a fraudulent portfolio for a massive industrial warehouse development, supposedly located on the far west side of the city. He was funneling every luxury wedding expense through this phantom project by deliberately mislabeling vendor invoices as standard construction costs. The $55,000 floral arrangement bill was officially recorded in our ledger as heavy-duty soil stabilization and commercial landscaping. The $84,000 catering bill was fraudulently filed as long-term rentals for specialized excavation machinery. He had even managed to expense the $18,000 custom silk and lace wedding gown Sienna was currently wearing by classifying it as high-grade industrial steel scaffolding. He was mocking the company I had spent 4 decades bleeding for. The truth about Sienna's family was now impossible to ignore. They were not wealthy socialites from old money. They were completely broke. They were pathetic frauds projecting an image of extreme wealth without a single dollar to back it up. Brendan was so desperate to impress this manipulative woman and her pretentious parents that he was willing to commit massive corporate fraud just to purchase their approval. He was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my business to finance a counterfeit lifestyle for a woman who was actively plotting to destroy his own mother's life. He was literally funding the very event at which they planned to publicly humiliate my disabled wife. This was no longer simply a heartbreaking story about a deeply ungrateful son exploiting his wealthy father. This was not a routine family dispute over a spoiled child borrowing money without asking. This was a severe, calculated, and highly organized financial crime. Brendan was committing felony embezzlement on a massive corporate scale. By routing these fabricated invoices through my business, he was artificially inflating our operational expenses, which struck directly at our corporate tax filings. He was placing my entire contracting empire at serious risk of federal tax evasion, charges, heavy financial penalties, and potentially devastating government audits. He was actively threatening the livelihoods of the 300 hardworking men and women who depended on my company to put food on their tables every single week. I thought about the loyal foremen, the dedicated bricklayers, and the exhausted project managers who spent 12 hours a day ensuring our projects came in on schedule. They had poured themselves into building a solid reputation for Harwick commercial contracting. Brendan was sitting in an air-conditioned office casually signing away their hard-earned profits to cover imported champagne and out-of-season white roses. The contempt he showed for the very foundation of our family's wealth was utterly unforgivable. I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, the digital evidence of his felony crimes staring right back at me. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation, any small desperate hope that my son could somehow be pulled back from the edge, it all evaporated into the cold air of the bridal suite. When you spend your life building structures, you learn quickly that you cannot compromise with a cracked foundation. You cannot negotiate with rot. Trying to patch over a fundamental structural failure only delays the moment the entire building comes down. Brendan was a catastrophic structural failure. He was a liability threatening to bring down everything I had built and everyone I loved. The gloves were completely off. I was no longer functioning as a grieving, bewildered father, trying to understand where things went wrong. I was functioning as the ruthless chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and I had just discovered a rat gnawing through the main power lines of my business. I closed the corporate email application and locked the tablet, taking care to set it back precisely where I had found it. I had no need to take the device with me. The fraudulent invoices, the fabricated project budgets, and the deeply incriminating communications with the estate lawyer were all permanently backed up on our secure corporate servers. I already had every piece of evidence I would ever need to dismantle his life completely. I rose from the leather chair and smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket with perfectly steady hands. The quiet observation phase had officially come to a close. It was time to begin the demolition. I turned from the desk and moved deliberately toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. The muffled sound of the jazz band drifted up faintly through the floorboards from the grand ballroom below. The oblivious guests were down there enjoying expensive cocktails and lavish appetizers, purchased entirely with money he had stolen from me. They were toasting the union of two people who embodied the very worst of human nature. I wrapped my hand around the brass doorknob and felt a profound clarity settle over me. I knew precisely what had to happen next. I needed to assemble my demolition team. I pulled the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite shut behind me, easing the latch quietly into place. The thick hallway carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps as I walked away from the room that held the digital record of my son's ultimate betrayal. I did not take the grand sweeping marble staircase back down to the main foyer where the guests were gathered. Instead, I bypassed the ornate elevators and shouldered open a heavy fire door leading to the venue's emergency stairwell. The air inside was entirely different from the opulent corridors, cool, stale, completely silent, carrying a faint trace of concrete and industrial floor cleaner. It reminded me of an unfinished job site. I descended half a flight and stopped on the concrete landing sealed off from the celebration, echoing through the rest of the building. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my suit jacket and drew out my phone. I had no need to scroll through my contacts. I dialed my corporate attorney's direct private cell number from memory. Leonard was not simply a lawyer. He was a fiercely aggressive, deeply strategic legal shark who had spent the last 20 years defending my commercial contracting empire against predatory competitors and fraudulent subcontractors. He was exactly the kind of man you wanted in your corner when it was time to tear a compromised structure down to its bare studs. The line rang twice before he answered. Leonard never took weekends fully off. His sharp, gravelly voice came through the speaker with the familiar bearing of a man perpetually braced for a corporate emergency. He greeted me and asked whether there was a problem with the venue contracts I had signed for the wedding. I pressed my back against the cold concrete wall of the stairwell and looked down at the empty steps below me. I told him the venue was fine, but that we had a catastrophic internal breach within the company requiring his immediate and ruthless intervention. I heard the distinct sound of a chair rolling back on hardwood as Leonard gave me his full attention. I didn't waste a breath circling around the painful reality. I spoke in the precise, detached register of a chief executive delivering a terminal damage report. I told him that my son, his regional vice president of operations, had actively conspired to commit massive corporate fraud. I laid out how Brendan had secretly manufactured a completely fictitious industrial warehouse project inside our corporate accounting system to systematically embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars. I explained that the stolen funds were being illegally channeled to finance the lavish luxury wedding taking place just on the other side of that fire door. Leonard stayed completely silent for several seconds, absorbing the full magnitude of the legal exposure Brendan had recklessly created for my company. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold, metallic edge that told me he had already shifted into total demolition mode. He asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I gave him his orders with absolute precision. I instructed Leonard to immediately contact our primary corporate banking representatives. I directed him to freeze every joint operational account that Brendan held any level of authorized access to. I told him to completely sever my son's digital footprint from the company servers and permanently revoke his administrative access. I wanted every high-limit corporate credit card canceled immediately reduced to useless pieces of plastic before the night was through. But that was only the opening move of the financial execution. I drew a slow, deep breath, pulling the stale stairwell air into my lungs before delivering the most critical directive of all. I told Leonard to immediately access the master file for the Harwick Trust. I instructed him to draft the necessary emergency paperwork to fully and permanently strip my son of his status as sole beneficiary of my estate. I told Leonard about the horrifying medical conservatorship plot I had uncovered on the tablet upstairs. I explained how Brendan and his new bride had actively conspired to weaponize my wife's recent stroke to have us both declared mentally incompetent. Leonard exhaled a low, disgusted breath. In all our years fighting ruthless corporate adversaries, he had never encountered a betrayal so intimately evil. I ordered him to construct an impenetrable legal firewall around my wife and me. I wanted the trust restructured so tightly that my son could never reach a single dime of our wealth, even if we were both incapacitated. I told him to redirect the inheritance entirely to charitable foundations and targeted medical research grants dedicated to stroke recovery. Brendan had wanted to exploit his mother's illness to seize a fortune, so that exact fortune would now be directed toward funding a cure for her condition. The poetic justice of it was absolute and undeniable. I instructed Leonard to have the preliminary trust revocation documents drafted, finalized, and ready for my signature by early Monday morning. But cutting off his access to future wealth was simply not sufficient. A crime had been committed against my company, against my employees, and against the integrity of everything I had constructed over the last 40 years. I gave Leonard the final, most devastating order. I told him to formally compile all of the evidence concerning the fabricated warehouse project, the doctored vendor invoices, and the stolen $300,000. I directed him to prepare a comprehensive formal criminal complaint for felony embezzlement. Leonard asked whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to pursue criminal charges against my own flesh and blood. He cautioned me that once that file was submitted to the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department, there was no walking it back. The state would assume control of the prosecution, and my son would face serious mandatory prison time. I did not blink. I did not waver. I fixed my gaze on the heavy metal hinges of the fire door and told my lawyer that the man downstairs was no longer my son. He was a thief, a liability, and a dangerous predator who had tried to destroy my wife. I wanted the criminal embezzlement file completed and formally delivered to the police department the moment their doors opened Monday morning. Leonard agreed without another word of hesitation. He assured me the entire financial execution would be prepared and ready to deploy before the weekend was out. I thanked him for his decades of unwavering loyalty and ended the call. I slipped the phone back into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. The trap was fully set. The legal guillotine was hanging heavily in the air, waiting for the rope to be cut. All that remained was surviving the excruciating length of the formal wedding reception. I pushed the heavy concrete stairwell door open, stepping back into the bright, opulent corridor of the luxury venue. I smoothed my tie, squared my posture, and began making my way toward the grand ballroom to witness the magnificent unraveling of the people who had tried to ruin my family. They believed they could pilfer my empire while making a cruel spectacle of my wife. They were about to receive a very painful education in the true cost of absolute betrayal. The traditional wedding ceremony took place in the glass-enclosed conservatory across the immaculate courtyard. I stood in the back row, watching the entire charade play out with a carefully practiced smile fixed to my face. Brendan and Sienna recited their handwritten vows beneath a canopy of imported ivory gardenias. They spoke of unwavering loyalty, eternal devotion, and building a foundation of absolute trust. It took every ounce of discipline I had developed over 40 years in commercial construction to keep from laughing outright. The hypocrisy radiating from their words was physically nauseating. They slid the rose gold rings onto each other's fingers, kissed for the cheering crowd, and walked back down the aisle to thunderous applause. I clapped right alongside the other 300 oblivious guests. Not a soul in that sunlit room understood they were applauding a pair of ruthless corporate embezzlers. They had no idea they were celebrating a couple who had actively plotted to emotionally demolish the fragile woman currently gripping my left arm. As the classical piano trio played out their final piece, the crowd began its slow, elegant drift toward the grand ballroom for the evening reception. I guided Elaine through the bustling courtyard, keeping my pace measured and unhurried to match her limited mobility. She leaned heavily on her polished wooden cane, her breath arriving in shallow, labored intervals. The physical strain of the long ceremony was already visible on her face, though she concealed it behind a warm, gracious smile. Guests intercepted us every few steps with hollow congratulations and wide-eyed admiration for the extravagance surrounding them. I nodded and thanked them quietly mentally, cataloging the stolen funds on display everywhere I looked. I took in the towering floral arrangements flanking the ballroom entrance. I noted the liveried staff gliding past, with silver trays of expensive vintage champagne. I registered the customized sculptures, slowly dissolving under the ambient light. Every element of this manufactured fairy tale had been purchased with my money. Brendan had bled my contracting empire dry to erect a monument to his own ego. But the hour of reckoning was drawing very close now. We passed through the heavy oak doors and entered the grand ballroom. The room was a stunning exhibition of opulent excess bathed in the soft, warm glow of the $18,000 sound system I had personally financed just a few months earlier. The 300 guests located their assigned tables, filling the space with a low roar of polished social chatter and clinking crystal. I filtered out the noise and kept my attention fixed on the woman beside me. I steered Elaine directly toward the raised platform at the front of the room. The sweetheart table occupied the center, flanked by immediate family seating on both sides. I approached the velvet cushioned chair bearing her gold-plated name card. My heart held a cold, steady beat as I drew the heavy mahogany frame back for her. I knew with complete certainty that this particular cushion was clean carefully swapped out by my own hands just hours before. Elaine turned slowly, gripping the sturdy armrests for balance. She lowered herself gracefully onto the plush velvet, releasing a quiet, relieved sigh as the soft fabric absorbed the weight from her aching back. I straightened the flowing train of her beautiful $6,000 embroidered chiffon gown, making sure the delicate fabric fell perfectly around her legs. I rested my hand gently on her shoulder and leaned down to tell her she looked absolutely stunning tonight. She reached up and laid her hand over mine, her eyes bright with genuine gratitude. She felt entirely safe in that chair, with no knowledge of the chemical nightmare that had originally been intended for her. The lively jazz band positioned in the ballroom's corner shifted into an upbeat driving melody. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, his booming voice slicing through the crowd's ambient noise. He called on the 300 seated guests to rise and welcome the new husband and wife. The grand double doors at the back of the room swung wide. Brendan and Sienna made their grand entrance, striding into the sweeping spotlight, to a wave of deafening applause and joyful cheering. Sienna looked like a flawless magazine cover, beaming triumphantly as she waved to the wealthy room. She was wearing a breathtaking custom-fitted Vera Wang bridal gown, crafted from the finest imported Chantilly lace and cascading silk tulle. It was an $18,000 masterpiece of high-fashion design, and every thread of that magnificent dress had been financed through the fraudulent warehouse invoices Brendan had buried inside my corporate accounting ledgers. She was literally draped in the tangible evidence of my son's felony embezzlement. They crossed the polished marble dance floor, with total confidence basking in the stolen luxury enveloping them from every direction. They mounted the raised platform, offered one final wave to the cheering crowd, and turned to claim their seats at the decorated sweetheart table. I settled into my assigned seat directly to Elaine's right, keeping my posture loose and my expression perfectly composed. I watched carefully as Sienna approached her designated chair, the chair with the matching velvet cushion, the chair currently saturated deep into its core with industrial-grade heat-curing polyurethane adhesive. She gathered the sides of her heavy, voluminous Vera Wang gown, lifting the delicate layers of expensive lace to keep from catching her feet. She beamed at the wedding videographer positioned nearby, completely oblivious to the rugged, voice-activated field recorder, secretly capturing every word from directly beneath her. With a practiced, graceful movement, she lowered herself down her full body weight, pressing firmly into the thick velvet cushion. The trap was officially sprung. The chemical snare had claimed its intended target. The moment she settled into the seat, the mask of the radiant, joyful bride slipped for just a fraction of a second. Sienna turned her head slightly, her eyes snapping directly toward Elaine. It was a venomous, predatory, and deeply expectant stare. She was looking at my wife the way a butcher eyes a lamb, eagerly anticipating the inevitable. She was mentally counting down the minutes until her vicious, humiliating spectacle would finally play out. Then Sienna shifted her gaze and looked directly at me. She expected to find a tired, oblivious old man contentedly enjoying his son's wedding. What she found instead was me staring right back at her, my eyes as cold and unforgiving as fractured glass. I did not look away. I held her gaze with a terrifying stillness. I reached out slowly and lifted my crystal flute of vintage champagne. I raised it smoothly in her direction, a silent, chilling toast. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her perfectly contoured face. She couldn't understand why I was looking at her, as though she were already a ghost. She broke eye contact, quickly turning back to the crowd, with a smile shifting her weight deeper into the toxic velvet cushion. The countdown had officially begun. She was completely unaware that, with every minute she sat there smiling and drinking my stolen champagne, the chemical compound was actively sealing her spectacular ruin. The grand illusion of their perfect, untouchable life was about to shatter violently into a million broken pieces. The first course of the lavish dinner arrived with impeccable precision, a fleet of waiters in crisp white jackets moving through the grand ballroom like clockwork, setting plates of imported oysters and pan-seared sea bass before the 300 distinguished guests. I looked down at the expensive appetizer resting on the gold-rimmed china in front of me. A culinary masterpiece, every bite of it funded by the fraudulent warehouse, invoices Brendan had buried inside my corporate ledgers. I picked up my silver fork and began to eat, chewing, slowly, letting the bitter irony of the moment settle over me. Across the large circular table, Sienna was laughing loudly at a joke from one of her bridesmaids. She leaned back into her chair, pressing the intricate layers of her $18,000 Vera Wang gown firmly against the plush velvet cushion. She had absolutely no idea that a silent, invisible chemical reaction had already begun directly beneath her. Industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive is a remarkably resilient compound. It is engineered to endure extreme weather conditions, the vibrations of heavy machinery, and the brutal punishment of active commercial construction sites. But its most treacherous property is in how it cures. It requires a catalyst to transition from a thick, tacky gel into an immovable solid. That catalyst is heat. As Sienna sat there reveling in her stolen luxury, the natural warmth radiating from her body passed through the delicate silk tulle and chantilly lace of her expensive gown. That body heat seeped directly into the velvet cushion, activating the dormant adhesive I had placed in her designated spot. I watched her take a quick sip of champagne, shifting her weight slightly to the left. The microscopic fibers of her designer dress were already fusing permanently with the thickening gel. An hour passed slowly. The second course of prime rib and roasted broccolini was cleared away and replaced by towering silver trays of artisan desserts. I kept up polite conversation with the wealthy investors at the adjacent tables, projecting the image of a proud, at ease patriarch. Beside me, Elaine was genuinely enjoying herself. She complimented the floral arrangements and smiled warmly at the jazz band playing softly in the corner. She looked absolutely beautiful, and more importantly, she was completely safe. I glanced back toward the sweetheart table. The curing process was entering its final and most aggressive stage. The adhesive was no longer a sticky gel. It was hardening, rapidly bonding the fabric of the dress to the chair with the grip of industrial mortar. I noticed Sienna beginning to shift with visible discomfort. She reached behind her back, tugging subtly at the side of her waist. She leaned over and murmured something into my son's ear. Her face tightened into an expression of mild, irritated confusion. She could clearly feel the strange, restrictive pull, but her vanity prevented her from understanding its true source. She almost certainly assumed the rigid boning of her high-fashion corset was simply digging into her ribs after a heavy meal. She attempted to slide her hips forward to ease the tension, but her body barely responded. The fabric was already anchored to the seat. She frowned, rolling her shoulders forward to adjust her posture, unwittingly pressing the lower half of her gown even deeper into the hardening chemical snare. I took another unhurried sip of vintage champagne and watched the trap close its jaws. The ambient chatter of the grand ballroom began to quiet as the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone. He tapped his crystal glass, signaling the formal end of the dinner service. The time for the traditional wedding speeches had arrived. The room settled into a respectful hush. Brendan pushed his chair back and got to his feet. He took the wireless microphone and stepped with confidence to the front of the raised platform. He surveyed the 300 elite guests below him, projecting an aura of complete authority and measured maturity. He was a remarkable actor, a man capable of lying with such genuine sincerity that it was genuinely unsettling to observe up close. He opened his speech by thanking guests for traveling from across the country to share in this milestone. He spoke about the challenges of building a future, the value of hard work, and the importance of laying a solid foundation. Then Brendan turned and looked directly at our table. He locked eyes with me. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and loaded with a dark, predatory assurance. He raised his glass toward Elaine and me. "I want to take a special moment to honor my parents," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system I had paid for. "They have shown me what it means to weather the difficult storms of life. Recently, our family faced a terrifying medical challenge. My mother suffered a stroke, and it reminded all of us just how fragile life truly is." He paused deliberately, letting the guests murmur in sympathetic agreement. He looked at Elaine with a sickening expression of manufactured grief. Then his eyes returned to mine. "It taught me that the most important duty of a son is to protect the ones he loves when they are at their most vulnerable. Sometimes protecting your family means making incredibly difficult decisions to ensure they are properly cared for when they can no longer care for themselves." The audacity of those words landed like a physical blow. To everyone seated in the grand ballroom, Brendan sounded like a devoted son stepping up under the weight of a family tragedy. But I knew precisely what he was actually communicating. I had read the emails on his tablet. I had seen the medical dossiers and the messages to the estate lawyer. He was constructing the narrative for the conservatorship. He was laying the groundwork to have us declared mentally and physically incompetent. He was telling me to my face that he intended to strip away our rights and seize the Harwick Trust. He expected me to sit there helpless and unsuspecting, absorbing his polished words while he honed the blade he planned to drive into my back. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. And I did not allow a single trace of the cold fury burning inside me to surface on my face. Instead, I smiled, a warm, proud, impeccably crafted fatherly smile. I raised my hands and began to clap. I applauded his magnificent performance with slow, deliberate strikes of my palms. The rest of the ballroom joined in, immediately generating a thunderous wave of applause for the devoted, caring son. Brendan smirked, satisfied with his performance. He believed he had completely dominated the psychological chess match. He was convinced he was the sharpest mind in the room, effortlessly controlling every piece on the board. He had absolutely no idea he was a dead man walking. The 2 hours of the formal dinner service had officially drawn to a close. What you are about to witness is the moment everything Gerald had carefully prepared finally comes to bear, and the people who believed they were untouchable are about to find out just how wrong they were. Before we get there, tell me honestly, if someone you loved and trusted had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you wait, gather everything, and let the truth do the talking? The plates were cleared, the speeches concluded, and the polyurethane adhesive completed its silent chemical work. The delicate chantilly lace of the custom Vera Wang bridal gown was permanently, irreversibly fused to the plushed velvet cushion. The clock had finally run out. The applause for Brendan faded slowly into a quiet, expectant murmur as he settled back into his seat at the sweetheart table. The grand illusion held together for just a few more fleeting seconds. The master of ceremonies stepped forward once again, his booming voice rising above the soft, ambient music drifting through the room. He invited the guests to direct their attention to the center of the floor. It was time for the bride and groom to share their very first dance as husband and wife. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed suddenly, plunging the sprawling ballroom into a dramatic, romantic twilight. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness and fell on the sweetheart table where my son and his new bride were seated. Brendan smiled broadly for the hundreds of cameras trained on him. He rose with effortless ease, casually buttoning his tailored tuxedo jacket, projecting the polished image of a wealthy patriarch in the making. He turned towards Sienna and extended his right hand to guide his beautiful bride out onto the polished marble dance floor. I sat perfectly still beside Elaine, breathing slow and measured, watching the final act of their malicious production unfold. Sienna glowed under the harsh brilliance of the spotlight. She placed her manicured hand delicately into my son's waiting palm. With her free hand, she gathered the heavy, cascading layers of her expensive silk tulle skirt, preparing to rise with the practiced poise of a high society princess. She engaged her legs and shifted her weight forward to stand. She did not move. Her body stayed firmly anchored to the seat for a brief, baffling moment. Her flawless smile faltered. She glanced down at her lap, clearly assuming that a thick fold of her voluminous skirt had become wedged beneath a chair leg or snagged under the heel of her designer shoe. She released Brendan's hand and reached down to free the fabric pooling around her waist. Brendan leaned toward her brow, creasing in mild confusion, whispering a quick, urgent question. She shook her head sharply, forcing her bright smile back into place for the benefit of the videographers standing just a few feet away. She gripped the solid wooden edge of the sweetheart table, with both hands bracing herself to push up with force. Sienna drove her body upward in one determined heave. The thick velvet cushion did not yield. The industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive had cured into an unbreakable bond, permanently welding the delicate chantilly lace of her designer gown to the upholstery. Because her upper body lurched forward while her lower half stayed hopelessly anchored, the sheer force of her momentum caused the heavy mahogany chair to pitch forward onto its front legs. She gasped sharply, eyes flying wide with sudden, unvarnished panic, as she slammed both hands back onto the table to stop herself from toppling over. The chair crashed back down onto all four legs with a heavy, dull thud. The radiant bride's flawless facade shattered on the spot. All color drained from her carefully contoured face, replaced by a pale, sickly terror. The smile was gone. She twisted her torso frantically, craning over her own shoulder to see what was holding her down. Brendan seized her arm, his voice climbing in panicked, hushed demands, completely blind to the inescapable chemical trap holding his wife hostage. He pulled at her arm, trying to haul her physically to her feet, before the scene became any more humiliating in front of their wealthy guests. The spotlight bore down on them without mercy. 300 elite guests sat in absolute breathless silence, smartphones raised recording what was supposed to be a romantic fairy tale moment. Instead, they were watching a bride in a desperate, frantic struggle with a piece of banquet furniture. Sienna was hyperventilating now. The crushing weight of thousands of eyes broke what remained of her composure. She looked out into the darkened ballroom, her terrified gaze locking onto mine for a fraction of a second. I offered her nothing. I simply raised my chin, my expression as cold and immovable as stone. Driven by blind panic in the agony of the prolonged delay, she planted both feet flat against the polished marble floor. She let out a breathless, frustrated cry and hurled her entire body weight violently forward in one massive, desperate heave. The structural integrity of the $18,000 custom wedding gown finally surrendered to the ruthless grip of the cured commercial adhesive. The sound that followed was absolutely deafening in the hushed ballroom. A sharp, violent tearing ripped through the silence. The exquisite imported silk and the hand-stitched lace shredded violently straight down the center seam. The fabric gave way, completely tearing from the middle of her spine all the way down past her thighs. The sudden release sent Sienna pitching wildly forward. Her hands skidded off the edge of the sweetheart table, sending crystal champagne flutes and silverware crashing to the floor. She tumbled over the edge of the raised platform and plunged downward in a chaotic tangle of shredded white silk and broken tulle. She hit the polished marble dance floor with a heavy, painful impact. The heavy mahogany chair, still permanently cemented to the entire back half of her ruined designer dress, flipped over with her and dragged across the carpet, coming to rest awkwardly on its side just above her. A collective horrified gasp erupted from all 300 guests simultaneously. It was a wall of pure shock that swept through the entire ballroom. Sienna lay sprawled on the cold floor, completely exposed to the merciless glare of the white spotlight. The bottom half of her dress was utterly destroyed, sheared entirely away, leaving her lying there in nothing but her sheer, minimal undergarments. The very public humiliation she had plotted, with such gleeful precision to inflict upon my disabled, vulnerable wife, had swallowed her whole. Hundreds of smartphone flashes lit up the darkened room like lightning in a violent storm. The social elite of the city were actively documenting her complete degradation, capturing every humiliating detail for the world to consume. Brendan stood frozen at the sweetheart table, his mouth hanging open in stunned, paralyzed disbelief. He stared down at his new bride sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, then slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. In that moment, he understood that the clueless old man he thought he was effortlessly manipulating had just executed a flawless and ruthless demolition of everything he had built. The live jazz band sputtered to a discordant, ugly halt. I sat perfectly still and felt a fierce, unapologetic wave of satisfaction move through me. The elaborate trap they had constructed out of raw greed, pure cruelty, and unchecked arrogance had snapped shut around their own necks. Sienna scrambled frantically on the cold marble floor, sobbing as she clawed at the tattered, ruined shreds of her gown in a desperate attempt to cover her exposed legs. But the heavy wooden chair remained stubbornly bonded to her back, mocking every pathetic movement she made. The pandemonium that erupted through the grand ballroom was unlike anything I had witnessed in 4 decades of managing chaotic construction sites. The initial stunned silence shattered instantly, replaced by a deafening surge of gasps, panicked voices, and the relentless clicking of hundreds of cameras. The city's elite were not accustomed to witnessing such raw, unfiltered humiliation, and human nature drove every one of them to record every second. Sienna continued to thrash on the polished floor, her frantic movements only amplifying the sickening, tearing sounds of the remaining silk still clinging to the heavy wooden chair. 2 of her bridesmaids finally broke free from their frozen shock. They surged forward and snatched a long white linen table runner from a nearby dining table. They threw the fabric over Sienna's lower half, desperately trying to shield her exposed undergarments from the spotlight's glare and the crowd's unrelenting lenses. Brendan was completely unraveling. The carefully constructed mask of the composed, confident groom had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a terrified and scrambling fraud. He dropped to his knees on the dance floor, grabbing Sienna by the shoulders and straining to lift her. But the sheer mass of the mahogany chair, still firmly cemented to her by the cured industrial adhesive, made it an awkward, physically punishing effort. Every attempt to pull her upright sent the chair dragging heavily across the floor, wrenching the remaining shreds of her expensive gown tighter against her skin. She shrieked in agony and humiliation, slapping his hands away and begging anyone to kill the blinding lights. Brendan shouted furious, incoherent orders at the venue staff, demanding they stop recording and clear a path to the exit. Brendan locked his grip around Sienna's arm and hauled her off the floor, part drag, part lift. A wretched, mortifying exit by any measure. Sienna had no choice but to shuffle along in a hunched crouch, one hand clutching the linen runner around her midsection, the heavy banquet chair lurching and swinging at her back like some ungainly wooden anchor. The two of them bulldozed through the assembled guests, trailing shredded white silk and velvet fragments across the floor behind them, making a beeline for the grand staircase and the private bridal suites above. With the ballroom's merciless attention focused elsewhere, I stayed in my seat at the sweetheart table just a beat longer. I finished what remained of my vintage champagne in a single unhurried sip. Elaine was beside me, safe in her chair, her eyes still wide from the catastrophe that had just played out in front of everyone. I reached over and pressed my hand lightly over hers. "Stay here with our friends," I told her quietly. I would go upstairs and take care of it. I got to my feet and straightened the front of my suit jacket. No urgency in my stride, I moved toward the grand staircase with the kind of measured pace that belongs to a man who already knows how the story ends. I had no reason to hurry. A man who has already won doesn't scramble, he walks. The sounds that guided me upward were impossible to miss, wailing, furious voices, all of it spilling down the second-floor corridor. The door to the private bridal suite was standing wide open, left that way in their blind panic to get off the ballroom floor. I paused in the frame and took stock of what lay inside. Total ruin. The suite looked like the aftermath of a collapse, not a celebration. Sienna was face down across a plush leather sofa, her face pressed hard into a decorative pillow, shoulders heaving with every sob. Above her, the mahogany chair jutted straight toward the ceiling, a ridiculous, ugly trophy of her own undoing. Her mother had arrived right on their heels and was now hovering over Sienna in full panic, a pair of sharp floral scissors in her fist that she'd grabbed from a hallway arrangement on the way in. She was working frantically at the velvet cushion and the wreckage of the Vera Wang gown, slashing it layer after layer in a desperate attempt to free the fabric from the cured polyurethane beneath. The adhesive was indifferent to her efforts. That compound bonds at the fiber level, microscopic, permanent. Every cut she made only caused the gown to fray further outward, the core of it, staying exactly where it was welded to the wood and velvet, as if it had been poured there. Across the room, Brendan was burning off his panic in tight, furious laps, both hands raking through his hair, his chest working fast and shallow. The flush across his face told the whole story. Humiliation and rage wound together so tightly he couldn't separate them. What he needed was a target, someone to absorb the blame for the wreckage his own scheme had produced. He caught sight of me in the doorway and stopped dead. Whatever fear had flickered across his face in that first instant vanished almost immediately, swallowed up by something harder and more combative. He still thought he knew who he was dealing with, the reliable, bendable father-in-law who'd always found a way to smooth things over. He covered the distance between us fast and pulled up close, one finger jabbing toward my chest. His voice pitched high and cutting. "Look what your venue did." He snapped face, twisted into something meant to read as righteous fury. "Look at what happened to her dress. You picked this place. You paid for these cheap, defective chairs. You completely ruined our wedding. You let this happen to us." He stood there, chest pushed forward, breathing hard, playing the wronged man as convincingly as he could manage. He was waiting for the familiar script to kick in my apology, my stumbling explanation, my offer to call lawyers or open my wallet and bury the problem under more money. He'd spent years counting on that reflex. I gave him nothing, not one word of apology, not a flicker of reassurance. My eyes moved from his outstretched finger to his face, straight into the fear living just behind the bluster. I let his accusations sit there in the air, untouched, draining of force with every second I refused to respond. Then I moved past him without a word and crossed to the door. I took it by the edge and swung it closed. I threw the brass deadbolt home. The clunk of the lock, engaging dense, final metallic, landed in that room like a gavel. There was no misreading that sound. I turned and put my back against the door arms folded across my chest, and let the silence I'd brought in with me do its work. It didn't take long. The atmosphere in that suite shifted the moment the lock clicked. Something physical seemed to leave the room with it. Sienna pulled her face up from the pillow and looked over at me, the sobbing stalled by sheer bewilderment. Her mother's hand went still, scissors suspended in the air, going nowhere. Brendan's arm dropped to his side. The posture of aggression he'd been wearing dissolved off his shoulders as whatever I was projecting finally reached him. Not a word had been spoken. The quiet in that suite became total, the kind that presses down on a room and holds everyone inside it absolutely motionless. I stayed against the door a few seconds more, letting that stillness work itself deep into all three of them. Then I stepped forward and moved toward the middle of the room at an unhurried pace. My voice stayed exactly where it was low-controlled level. I had no interest in shouting, no impulse to overturn furniture or fill the room with noise. When a man is holding what I was holding, volume is unnecessary. The room's attention was already his. I went past Sienna's mother without looking at her. I went past Brendan without looking at him. I stopped in front of the large flat-screen television on the far wall. My phone came out of my jacket pocket. A few taps brought up the wireless display settings. A soft chime signaled the pairing, my device connecting cleanly to the television screen, polite as a knock at the door. Then I reached into the other pocket and drew out the rugged voice-activated field recorder I'd pulled from beneath the sweetheart table in the confusion, right after the gown gave way. I raised it so the whole room could see exactly what it was. In the same low, unhurried tone I'd been using since I walked in, I told them plainly I had positioned that device under their chairs myself, before the reception ever started. Brendan's throat worked visibly as he swallowed the color, leaving his face in a slow, steady withdrawal. I ran the cable from the field recorder to my phone and pushed the audio out through the ceiling, speakers the premium surround sound system the suite was fitted with. Then I hit play. The recording came through clean and sharp, high-definition audio, filling every corner of the room. Underneath the voices, you could hear silverware against china, the low drift of live jazz from the reception floor below the dinner service near its end. Sienna's voice arrived first amplified and unmistakable, carrying all the impatience and contempt she'd never bothered to hide when she thought no one was listening. She was complaining about the heat, about how the corset was crushing her ribs. And then the ugliness that had been building beneath all of it finally surfaced in the open, the words that made her own father flinch and take a step back, as though the sound of them had weight. "I am so tired of waiting." The recorded voice of Sienna whined loudly for everyone in that suite to hear. "Why hasn't she gotten up to use the restroom yet? You told me she had severe bladder control issues. I cannot sit here all night waiting for this pathetic stroke victim to finally embarrass herself." The room locked up. Sienna's father moved backward one slow, unsteady step, as if the cruelty in his daughter's voice had reached out and pushed him. But it was Brendan's answer that closed the door on any future they might have imagined for themselves. His voice came through the speakers low, and almost amused a quiet, pleased sound that carried exactly what it was. "Just be patient," my son said on the recording, with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had everything under control. "The longer she sits there, the tighter the chemical bond gets. Once she finally stands up, she's going to rip herself wide open. Just make sure your camera is completely ready. We need that massive public meltdown captured on video for the lawyer tomorrow morning." I pressed pause on the field recorder. The silence that dropped over the room in the wake of those words was dense and poisonous, the kind that comes when people finally understand exactly who they have been dealing with. Sienna let out a muffled, pitiful sob from the leather sofa, but not one person in that room moved toward her. Her mother stood motionless, the floral scissors lowering slowly to her side, staring down at the half-ruined figure of her daughter, as though she were looking at someone she had never seen before in her life. Brendan's mouth opened. His hands came up shaking, reaching forward in the universal posture of a man with nothing left to offer but surrender. He began to stammer, reaching for the words that would make this into a misunderstanding, a private joke, dark humor, twisted out of shape by a moment of terrible stress. I didn't give him the room to finish. I tapped my phone screen and opened the encrypted photo gallery where I had stored the evidence pulled from his device that same afternoon. The images mirrored straight onto the television. Their private text messages lit up across the screen in bright, unambiguous detail, fully readable by everyone standing in that suite. I pointed at the display, steady no tremor in my hand, and told the bride's parents to look carefully at the words their daughter had typed with her own fingers. There it was, Sienna's message explicit and deliberate, laying out a plan to humiliate my disabled wife in front of 300 guests as the foundation for a legal grab. And beneath it, Brendan's reply, cold, precise, methodical walking through exactly how the financial and legal consequences would fall. I swiped to the next image. The email thread with the boutique estate attorney filled the screen. I read it aloud. My voice carried no warmth, no hesitation, flat and steady as a judge who has already rendered the verdict and is simply reading it into the record. Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says, we have a slam dunk case for a conservatorship, I read. We declare Mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation, he will not fight it. We force him to hand over the trust to me immediately today. I moved to the final screenshot. The words expanded across the screen at a scale that left nothing to interpretation, filling the room with their naked, graceless greed. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. Sienna's parents stood locked in place, rendered completely motionless by what was being displayed in front of them in sharp, undeniable resolution. They had spent the past year celebrating this marriage to anyone who would listen, the prestigious family connection, the wealth, the social elevation it represented. Now they were facing the reality that their daughter and her new husband had been quietly engineering the destruction of two elderly people to steal everything those people had built. Sienna's mother retreated slowly from the sofa, putting distance between herself and the weeping figure on the cushions, looking at her own child with an expression that sat somewhere between revulsion and grief. The bride's father dropped his gaze to the floor jaw, tight, unable to offer me so much as eye contact. Brendan stood at the center of the suite and simply collapsed inward, not physically, but in every other way that matters. The shoulders that had been squared and aggressive all evening rounded forward. His breathing was fast and shallow. The confident, polished groom, who had walked into this building believing he had every angle covered, was finished. What remained was something much smaller, a man watching the elaborate architecture of his own scheme fold in on itself, every layer of it stripped away by the one person he had written off as a harmless obstacle. He understood in that moment that the man he had dismissed as a naive old fool had been several steps ahead of him the entire time. There was nothing left to negotiate, no softening plea or manufactured apology that could locate a crack in what had just been laid out before the room. The trap they had constructed so carefully to ensnare my wife had become the walls of their own cage. I lowered my phone. My eyes stayed on my son, unblinking without warmth, as I readied myself to deliver what came next. The silence broke when Brendan choked on his own breath. He took a lurching step in my direction, both hands raised, palms out, the posture of a man drowning and reaching for anything solid. His eyes went to the dark television screen, then back to me. Sweat was visible on his face. "Dad, wait." He managed his voice, fracturing into something thin and high, a register I hadn't heard from him since childhood, since the afternoon he broke a window and stood there hoping I wouldn't notice. "You are taking this entirely out of context. Those messages, the things we said about Mom, they were just jokes. It was just dark humor. We were stressed about the wedding planning, and we were just venting our frustrations. We would never actually do something like that to her. We would never actually try to take your money." I watched him work, trying to assemble a credible story on the fly in front of witnesses who had just watched his entire character displayed at full resolution. It was painful in the way that only genuine desperation can be. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The tone I used was precise and cold, and would have cut through reinforced steel just as cleanly. "Do not insult my intelligence, Brendan," I said, moving one deliberate step toward him. "You did not just joke about destroying your mother. You actively retained a boutique estate attorney. You illegally acquired her private medical records. You meticulously orchestrated a highly public, deeply humiliating physical trap to manufacture the exact visual evidence your lawyer requested. You built a guillotine, you sharpened the blade, and you placed her neck directly on the block. There is absolutely no context in the universe that justifies what you did today." Brendan's mouth opened again. His head was shaking. But the words evaporated before they reached the surface because my hand was already moving to the interior pocket of my suit jacket, not reaching for a phone this time. What I produced instead was a thick, neatly folded sheaf of printed documents. I carried them to the marble vanity where Sienna had sat that very morning, getting ready for the wedding she had used as a weapon. I set the papers down hard. The crack of the stack hitting the marble surface snapped through the room, and every person in it flinched. From the sofa, Sienna let out a small, frightened sound, pulling the stolen table runner tighter against herself. I turned back to face my son. "If you thought the conservatorship scheme was the only thing I found today, you have badly underestimated the man who taught you how to read a balance sheet." While you were out in the garden posing for photographs this afternoon, I had been working through your corporate email accounts. I watched the color evacuate his face entirely. He swayed a barely perceptible buckle in the knees, the body reacting before the mind could catch up. He already knew what was in that stack of papers. He knew his accounting trail had been sloppy, born of the same arrogance that had made him believe he was untouchable. I gestured toward the documents and made sure my voice was pitched to carry to every corner of the room, including where the bride's parents were standing. Those papers contained the full itemized vendor invoices for this $300,000 wedding reception, I told them. They also contained the fraudulent corporate budgets for a non-existent industrial warehouse project on the far west side of the city. The father of the bride turned slowly to look at Brendan. You did not pay for this wedding with your personal savings, Brendan, and your new bride certainly did not cover it with any family money of her own. You systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of my commercial operational accounts. You fraudulently mislabeled floral arrangements as heavy-duty landscaping. You expensed a custom designer wedding gown as industrial steel scaffolding. You committed serious corporate felony embezzlement to purchase the goodwill of a woman who was busy plotting to destroy your own mother. Brendan was shaking now, a full-body tremor unmistakable and undignified. "Dad, please," he said, his voice collapsing into a whisper. "I can pay it back. I will work overtime. I will give you my entire salary. Just keep this in the family. Do not let the partners find out." I looked at him across that ruined room with the kind of contempt that doesn't need volume to land. "There is no salary for you to give me. Brendan," I replied, my voice level and absolutely without mercy. "While you were busy getting into your expensive tuxedo, I was on a private call with Leonard." The mere mention of my corporate attorney's name made Brendan physically recoil. He knew exactly what Leonard was, a legal predator who treated corporate liability cases the way a demolition crew treats a condemned building. "Leonard has spent the last hour executing a complete financial lockdown," I told him. "Every joint operational account you could access is frozen solid. Your administrative credentials on the servers have been wiped permanently. Those high-limit company cards in your wallet are dead plastic. You are terminated as Regional Vice President of Operations effective right now. You have no position and you no longer represent my company in any capacity whatsoever." From the sofa, Sienna let out a loud, devastated wail, the sound of a woman who has just watched the endless river of wealth she believed she'd married into run completely dry. Brendan went down to his knees on the carpeted floor, both hands clutching his head, a portrait of absolute unvarnished ruin. But I wasn't done. I moved closer, standing over him, making certain that what came next would be seared into his memory permanently. "Terminating you is simply administrative housekeeping." I continued, my voice dropping to something quiet and precise and dangerous. "A felony has been committed against my company, and I do not bury embezzlement to protect a thief just because that thief carries my last name. Leonard is building the fraudulent invoices and fabricated project budgets into a formal criminal complaint as we speak. That file will be on the desk of the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department the moment they unlock their doors Monday morning." Brendan looked up at me. The terror in his eyes had reached a pitch that was almost unrecognizable, something close to madness. "Dad, no," he cried out, tears finally breaking loose down his face. "You cannot send me to prison. I am your only son. You cannot do this to me." I looked down at him without pity, without hesitation, without a single flicker of regret. "You made your choices, Brendan. You decided money mattered more than your own mother's safety. You decided that everything I spent a lifetime building was simply a resource available for you to plunder. You wanted to play the ruthless predator, but you were nothing more than a sloppy, arrogant amateur." I brought my face a few degrees closer to his, delivering the verdict in a tone that left no air for appeal. "You wanted to have someone declared incompetent to steal a fortune. Try doing that with a felony conviction on your record." The words settled over the room like a ceiling coming down. Brendan stared up at me from the floor, the last fragments of his manufactured confidence disintegrating in real time. His hands reached out and found my suit trousers, gripping the fabric with shaking fingers. He begged for his freedom, for his father, for the mercy of the very man he had spent months maneuvering to destroy. "Dad, please, you cannot do this." The sobs came in waves now, his face drained and wet. "I am your flesh and blood. You cannot send your own son to federal prison. I will sign away every claim I have to the trust. Just call Leonard and tell him to pull the criminal complaint." I stood there and looked at him. For the whole of my adult life, I had worked without rest to give this boy every advantage I never had. I gave up time, sleep, and peace of mind to make sure he would never have to scratch and claw through the dirt the way I did when I was building this company from nothing. I handed him the world, and he used what I gave him to construct a trap for his own mother. I searched myself for some remaining reserve of paternal feeling. There was nothing. The well had run dry. The man on his knees in front of me was no longer my son. He was a convicted felon waiting for the authorities to catch up with him. I bent down and methodically peeled his fingers from my trousers, then smoothed the fabric with a slow, deliberate motion. "You forfeited the right to call yourself my son the moment you turned your mother's medical suffering into a financial instrument," I said, my voice stripped of every trace of warmth. "You traded your family for stolen money and a social status built on fraud. You made your choice, Brendan. Now you carry the weight of it." Across the suite, Sienna let out another agonized shriek. She was hopelessly tangled in the shredded wreckage of her Vera Wang bridal gown, her body still half bonded to the heavy mahogany banquet chair. The industrial adhesive had cured to full strength, fusing the chantilly lace permanently to the velvet cushion. She thrashed against the leather sofa, screaming at her parents to do something to fix this to pull her free. But her parents were finished. Her father stood looking at his daughter with undisguised disgust. Then he turned his back on her, entirely took his wife firmly by the arm, and walked them both toward the door without a word. They left the room, carrying the visible shame of people who finally understand what they produced. Sienna understood in that same moment what had evaporated the fortune she thought she'd married into the safety net she had built this entire scheme to reach. She understood that embezzlement charges were now waiting for her, alongside a disgraced husband. She folded herself into a small, defeated shape on the sofa, the stolen table runner clutched to her chest, permanently attached to the wooden monument of everything she had done. I turned away from all of it. I moved toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite at an unhurried pace. Behind me, Brendan scrambled across the carpet, his voice climbing into a final cracking surge of desperation. "Dad, do not walk out that door." He screamed, the composure fully gone now. "If you leave, my life is over. Please, I am begging you, do not leave me here like this." I didn't break stride. I reached the door and closed my hand around the brass deadbolt I had thrown not long before. I turned the mechanism and pulled it back one clean, sharp click. I took the ornate handle, pulled the door wide, and let the light from the hallway flood in. I did not look back. I didn't say goodbye. I stepped out and let the heavy door swing closed at my back, severing whatever remained between me and that room for good. I walked the hallway with my head up. I reached the marble staircase and descended. The atmosphere in the grand foyer below had transformed entirely. The raw shock of the dress incident had fermented into something else, a restless buzzing energy among the assembled guests, the kind that only comes when wealthy people have witnessed something genuinely spectacular and cannot stop talking about it. Clusters of formally dressed guests held their phones up in tight circles, passing around footage of the bride going down with a chair bonded to her back. I moved through the staring eyes and murmured speculation without pausing, back through the towering floral arrangements, back into the grand ballroom. The live jazz band was packing away their instruments, the celebratory atmosphere long since gutted. Waitstaff moved quietly between the tables, collecting crystal champagne flutes in silence. I crossed the room, threading between the circular dining tables, my eyes fixed on the raised platform at the front of the ballroom. Elaine was seated exactly where I had left her, upright, composed, her bearing serene and dignified, in spite of everything swirling around her. Her gown draped beautifully around her untouched, exactly as it should be, the chemical snare they had laid for her, reduced to nothing, dismantled before it could reach her. She watched me cross the room toward her, reading my face carefully for any sign of damage. I came to the table and stopped in front of her. I gave her a smile, warm, unhurried, genuine. I slipped my suit jacket from my shoulders and settled it around hers. I leaned in and pressed a quiet kiss to her forehead. "Are you ready to go home, my love?" I asked. She reached up and touched my cheek. "I am perfectly ready," she said, her voice even and calm. She took hold of her polished wooden cane and rose from the chair, standing straight and unbroken, clear of every trap they had built for her. I offered her my arm. She threaded her hand through mine. Together we turned away from the sweetheart table and moved down the center of the grand ballroom. The remaining guests drew aside without being asked, opening a path to the doors. We walked through them and into the cool night air, leaving the whispers, the scattered silk, and the smoldering wreckage of my son's life somewhere in the dark behind us, and not once looking back. A full year has gone by since that night in the grand ballroom. The cool air that met Elaine and me as we stepped out of that luxury venue felt like drawing breath for the very first time after a long suffocation. 40 years of building a commercial contracting empire teaches you to carry weight, the constant grinding pressure of payroll-active job sites, and people who depend on you without complaint, without relief, without ever setting it down. But as those heavy oak doors swung shut behind us and sealed everything inside, I felt that burden simply fall away. My obligation to protect and subsidize my son had run its course. He was no longer someone I owed anything to. He had made himself into an adversary, one who had badly miscalculated the man he was trying to outmaneuver. The following Monday morning, I honored every word I had spoken in that bridal suite. Leonard, my corporate attorney, walked the full embezzlement file straight into the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department and placed it on their desk. The authorities moved fast. While the detectives assembled their criminal case against Brendan, I was engineering a sweeping change in my own professional life. For years, the only reason I had kept Harwick Commercial Contracting running was the belief that I was constructing something to hand down to my son one day, a generational legacy with his name on it. That illusion was gone, now burned away completely. There was no longer any reason to keep grinding through the demands of commercial construction. I put the company up for sale without fanfare. The business was profitable, structurally sound, and fully cleared of the financial rot Brendan had quietly introduced, so it drew serious interest from multiple buyers almost immediately. I ultimately sold to a large national development conglomerate for a staggering 8-figure sum. I took that capital, folded it into my existing holdings, and completely restructured the Harwick Trust, ensuring that the financial firewall Leonard had built around Elaine and me was airtight and permanent. While I was converting assets and locking down a stress-free retirement, Brendan was getting his first extended look at how the criminal justice system actually operates. The investigation into his fabricated warehouse project moved with precision and no mercy. The paper trail he left behind was staggeringly careless, the product of a man so convinced of his own invulnerability that he never bothered to cover his tracks. He had genuinely believed that hiding behind a forged version of my signature would keep him untouchable. Instead, it handed the federal prosecutors a clean, unbroken timeline of his crimes. Faced with an overwhelming wall of financial evidence, his high-priced defense attorney told him to take a deal. Brendan pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corporate fraud and grand theft. He is currently housed in a federal holding facility, waiting for his final sentencing hearing next month. The presiding judge has already signaled that he is looking at a mandatory minimum of 7 to 10 years in federal prison. There will be no wealthy father stepping in to cover his restitution, and no cushion landing waiting for him on the other side. He surrendered a lifetime of guaranteed security and family support in exchange for a few months of stolen comfort and the thrill of conspiring against his own mother. He is now learning the profound difference between a temporary victory and a permanent, devastating defeat. Sienna fared no better in the wreckage that followed, the instant she grasped that Brendan had been completely severed from the Harwick fortune. Whatever devotion she had managed to perform evaporated entirely. She filed for divorce just 3 weeks after the wedding, moving fast to put legal distance between herself and his mounting criminal exposure. It didn't save her, because the fraudulent funds Brendan had used to finance the extravagant reception were seized and clawed back during the corporate audit. Sienna and her social climbing parents were left holding the outstanding vendor balances themselves. She is currently drowning under a pile of debt she cannot climb out of, pursued by collection agencies over canceled honeymoon packages and the destroyed $18,000 designer gown. Her social standing, her wealthy lifestyle, and the carefully curated public image she had built, all of it gone in a single evening. She is a pariah in the city now, the woman people remember as the bride who ended up bonded to a banquet chair in her undergarments. As for Elaine and me, we simply left. The toxicity, the legal noise, the wreckage of everything that had festered around us, we left it all behind without looking back. Right now, we are on the private balcony of a luxury suite aboard a magnificent cruise ship drifting slowly across the crystal-clear, sapphire waters of the Caribbean Sea. The warm ocean breeze carries salt and something that smells very much like freedom, a world away from the poisoned air of the life we shed. Elaine's recovery over these past 12 months has been nothing short of remarkable. Released from the invisible weight of the stress and the quiet menace our son had been pressing down on her, her physical therapy accelerated beyond anything her doctors had projected. She doesn't use her wooden cane on the ship's deck anymore. She moves with a lightness and strength that I hadn't seen in years, her face carrying a kind of peace that no amount of money could have purchased. We spend our days wandering ancient coastal towns, eating extraordinary food, and inhabiting the life we spent 40 years earning together. No one here has a claim on us. No one is quietly calculating what we're worth to them. Watching the sun drop toward the horizon and flood the water in shades of gold and deep crimson, I've arrived at something I now understand with complete clarity. Blood is a biological fact, nothing more. It does not come preloaded with unconditional love. It does not automatically earn respect, and it does not under any circumstances excuse deliberate, calculated cruelty toward the people who are most vulnerable to it. Real family is something you construct the same way you build anything worth keeping, on a foundation of loyalty, mutual respect, and an instinct to shield one another from harm rather than manufacture it. Elaine and I built that together across 4 decades of shared sacrifice. We defended it when the person who had every reason to protect it instead tried to tear it down. We came through the storm, and now, finally, we get to live in the quiet that follows. Sometimes the ones who carry your blood are the most willing to drain it. We build our legacies with open hands, too devoted to what we want to believe about our children, to see what's plainly in front of us. But loyalty isn't something a trust fund buys, and respect isn't owed because someone paid for your upbringing. When you discover a viper living inside your walls, you don't sit down and reason with it. You remove it and you close the door. That is where this story ends. Out on the open water, with Elaine walking unassisted across the deck and the weight of everything we once carried finally gone. Looking back, none of it came without a cost. You do not watch your own son become a stranger without something inside you going quiet in a way it never fully recovers from. But I believe God places certain moments in front of us, not to break us, but to show us what we are actually made of and what we are truly fighting to protect. This story tested everything, and everything that mattered came through it intact. For those of you who have followed these father stories or who came to this one searching for something that made sense of your own pain, I hope what Gerald and Elaine carried gives you something solid to hold on to. Here is what I take from all of it. If someone is willing to harm a vulnerable person to get what they want, no amount of love you give them will change that calculation, and protect yourself first. Do not wait for betrayal to become undeniable before you start paying attention. The signs are rarely hidden. We are. A father's quiet work is not weakness. Gerald's patience, his preparation, his refusal to act out of raw emotion. That is what made Dad's revenge complete and permanent. Blood does not owe you loyalty, and loyalty does not owe you blood. Build your family on what people actually do, not what you hope they mean. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you might expect. And if you have not yet found His Hidden Revenge, subscribe and stay close. There is more to come. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourselves and of the people who have actually earned that place in your life.